Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And this episode, we wanted to talk a bit about what defines a series, because we find ourselves getting a lot of remakes, remasters, as well as sequels to long-running series after short periods of time, long periods of time, across several consoles. So what it is about certain series that defines them or qualifies them as belonging to that series.
Yeah, we've talked about remakes before, but in the past it's just kind of been like, remakes, what's the deal? Whereas this, I think, is because there's this habit now of really iconic games or game series coming out with new games that are either brand new remakes or just getting graphical upgrades. I mean, the ones that I'm thinking of off the top of my head right now is, of course, the Resident Evil 2 remake, which more or less rebuilds the game from the ground up. The story is similar, but there's new stuff included, and the mechanics are almost completely different because it's based on the Resident Evil 7 engine as opposed to what Resident Evil 2 was built on back in the day. And the other one I'm thinking of is one I've actually played, which is the ToeJam and Earl Back in the Groove, which just came out. It was released by Adult Swim Games. I believe the creator is the original creator of ToeJam and Earl. It's a new game by him.
I think you're right.
But the gameplay is essentially ToeJam and Earl 1 for the Sega Genesis. Like, there's a graphical upgrade, there are some new mechanics, but it's the same style of gameplay, but with, some VO, some new, a ton of new graphics and some cool new Easter eggs and a bunch of hidden characters, additional hats that give you upgrades. But essentially, they built this new game from the ground up from the original version of ToeJam and Earl. So while it is a new game in the series, it's technically the fourth game in the series. Yes, there were three others. People forget the Xbox game.
We all try to forget, yeah.
It is essentially a remake of the first game because it's the same story. ToeJam and Earl get stranded on Earth, this time with two additional characters. And the spaceship gets blown up. They have to get the parts and go back to Funkatron, which is more or less the same thing as the original game. But also, nobody played the original ToeJam and Earl necessarily for the story. It was for the quirky gameplay, the ridiculous characters, the oddball human enemies in the game, things like that.
You played it to get funky.
You played it to get funky, absolutely. And what I think is really interesting, like trying to hone in on what makes a remake worth remaking, is what makes these games so iconic and genre-defying. Because ToeJam and Earl was always big to me, for example, but, I only recently discovered how many other people really loved that series, which was a surprise to me. But also back in the Sega Genesis days, it was hard to know, besides whoever lived on your block, who liked what, because the internet was still not really a thing.
Right. Well, and it's funny because I'm somebody who's very aware of the existence of ToeJam and Earl, but I don't think I've played more than 5 minutes of any single game. I'm aware of what the characters look like. I'm a little aware of what the overworld kind of navigation looks like, and I'm aware that if you don't touch the controller for a while, they yell at you to wake up. What kind of gameplay is it?
So essentially, it's an action platformer designed. It's interesting because there's combat in the game. You can get tomatoes to throw at the humans or certain items that protect you. But for the most part, you're supposed to dodge enemies, grab presents that give you power-ups. And so it's kind of more like a puzzle platformer than an actual action game because it's more geared towards navigating these maps, finding the ship parts, or finding the elevator to the next area, essentially.
Are they always in the same place, or is it kind of like randomized?
So the new game, actually, you can have either or. You can have fixed levels where each level goes in a progression until you complete the game, or you can select to have it randomized so every level is different. It all takes place on Earth, but that's only the first and fourth games. The second game takes place on Funkatron, and it's it's more of a side-scrolling action platformer because you actually have weapons and you're capturing humans who got loose on Funkatron.
Huh.
And then the third game, I don't even remember, to be honest. I played like 10 minutes of it, and it was terrible. But I think it was trying to do a 3D platformer version of the 2D platformer in the second game. And so the third game is returning to its roots, which makes a lot of sense. But again, the fact that you're so aware of the game, though barely having played it, might be a good mark of why this game got remade, rebooted, recreated, because it permeated a certain level of pop culture beyond just being a game that people played.
It definitely felt 90s as hell.
Yeah. I mean, that's for sure.
Yeah, very rad, tubular, funky, groovy man.
Yeah, and the music's always been exceptional. I'm at a loss on who the composer is at the moment, but like even the new game with modern technology is still very old school, digital, funky synths and stuff.
That makes sense. The Genesis sound chip is still very revered for its unique sounds that it made. The Yamaha FM.
Yes, but like I think what I'm getting around to is I think it's fascinating to look at games like Toe Jam and Earl or Resident Evil 2 or Ratchet and Clank, which came out 2 or 3 years ago, the remake. Like, why are these games getting remade? What about these games, makes them worth remaking? And what's interesting about the Resident Evil series is this isn't the first remake. The first remake they did was actually Resident Evil on the GameCube.
Back in 2002, yes.
And that was a total departure from the original game because as we talked about in the last episode, the original Resident Evil was good, but it had issues, as we discussed there, the voice acting ridiculousness.
It definitely had presentation issues.
But the remake, like, they redid everything. The voice acting, the graphics, they rejiggered some of the puzzles. And, it blew a lot of people away. And I think for that game, it was the first game in the series. A series that defined survival horror. So why remake that game? Because it was only hampered by its limitations at the time. So let's see what we can do with it when we have more advanced technology, better graphics, better voice recording, and all of that stuff.
And it's actually very interesting about when Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2's remakes happened. Because when the Resident Evil remake happened on the GameCube, I'm trying to remember if it was around the same time that they were making Resident Evil 4.
Yes, I believe so.
Whether it was just before or just after, it's the same console generation. I would probably say it was within the same year.
Yeah.
And at that point, they had the first 3 Resident Evils on the PlayStation and Code Veronica on the Dreamcast and later the PS2, which were all very connected thematically, very claustrophobic, very fixed camera angle so you weren't sure what was coming next, very limited ammo for everything. You need to find the ink ribbons in order to save on the typewriters. You can only save as many times as you find that item. It's not unlimited. And it literally created the term survival horror. And then Resident Evil 4 became a much more action-oriented sequel. And it's a great sequel. It's a wonderful game. But it changed what Resident Evil could be. And the first remake took all of that claustrophobia, all of that fear, all of that looming terror, and cranked it up, and was a superlative example at the time of what this kind of survival horror could be. There were modes and difficulties where there were certain kinds of zombies that if you didn't thoroughly kill them, they would come back stronger. In the old games, if you were chased by a bunch of zombies and you went into another room, closed the door, you were safe. They can't operate doors. Now they can. And there's one, I'm trying to remember exactly what the mode is called. I think it's called One Tough Zombie or One Bad Zombie or what it is. And you are just being pursued, proto Mr. X style.
Right.
And then after Resident Evil 4, the game became a much more, all right, we're still dealing with the Umbrella Corporation. We're still dealing with bioweapons, but we're doing it in a much more modern action game kind of way. And most people didn't really play 5 and 6.
Yeah, well, 5 had a whole host of issues with it, and then 6, I tried playing 6. It was just kind of unplayable between the disjointed story, the mediocre controls, but it wasn't until Resident Evil 7 came out that, they started to return back to their roots, and I think that's what inspired them to remake 2, is the fact that they have this engine that Capcom has built from the ground up that they're using for all their games now. Mm-hmm. And they revitalized the survival horror genre with 7 and how it was a return to form. And they were like, well, what's a game that's a return to form that people have been asking for a while? Well, let's remake Resident Evil 2.
Resident Evil 2, yeah.
Because that's a game that had multiple ports to different consoles, is regarded as one of the best of the original 3 games, you know. And I think 4 is only lauded higher because it's a change in a direction that people liked, but still stayed true to some of its roots, whereas 5 and 6 forgot that.
Right, because when you deviate a little bit, it still feels like it's part of the series, but then you deviate on that deviation and you deviate on that deviation and you lose sight of whatever it was, because whatever it is that defines the series or feels like it belongs in that series, it's not really quantifiable. You can't, grind a game down to its component parts and go, it is this. It is an essence, a feeling. In the Resident Evil 2 remake, there really isn't the static camera angles that you had in the first Resident Evil. You might lose out on a feeling of terror or what's coming next if you don't have the camera facing you half the time. You can still, Resident Evil 7 proved that the Resident Evil formula, whatever that may be, can still create a lot of terror while still feeling like a modern cinematic style game. There's a lot of new elements they can put in. There's a lot they can take away from you. And there's a lot of difficulty that they can then add and tweak and put in to give you that same, the feeling that I always had playing the original Resident Evils was definitely being a character in a horror movie.
Yeah.
That idea of being pursued, the idea of I need to get out of here somehow. The fights with Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 always were so exciting, exhilarating. They still are when I go back and play it, trying to take down Nemesis, which Mr. X is his forebear. And so he's even better now in Resident Evil 2. So you can still create that, terrified, pursued, harried, sweaty, breathing heavy feeling while still having a modern engine and a modern remake. And it is still a challenging, frightening game. And that's not always a guarantee.
No, and I think it's a testament also to the Resident Evil team that they were able to update Resident Evil 2 and still keep it as scary as the original was. I mean, a lot of what I've heard about, because I've also only played the demo, but a lot of what I've read and seen online is that Mr. X is terrifying now, not because he just busts through at fixed points in the game and you don't expect him, but because he can come at any time and you hear him coming a good long period of time before he's in the room with you. You hear him stomping because of how well the sound design is. And I think that's really interesting. And also the fact that even though there aren't fixed camera angles, the fact that it's still an over-the-shoulder shooter. Now you're looking forward all the time, so you have to manually turn around to see if something's sneaking up behind you is equally as scary, especially since now there's no electricity in this game. I mean,
you have to use a flashlight. That's what it is.
Yeah, there's a lot more darkness in this game than was on the original because now that you're so close to your character, it makes sense to have a dark room that you have to kind of scope out with your flashlight.
And these moments, the fact that they can, the engine can have Mr. X pursuing from so far away, and that you need to have your own flashlight, that sort of light engine, those are things we couldn't do in the PS1 era. Or the GameCube era. Probably not even in the PS3. But now we can do that. Sarah and I were having a conversation about Kingdom Hearts 3 because we just recently got it and are playing through it.
Right.
We noted the fact that, when you're in a new Disney World and people join your party, they just join your party.
Yep.
You don't have to replace anybody. I wonder why that is. And the theory we came up with, I haven't looked into this yet, is when the games were on the PS2, they couldn't handle more than 3 party members. So you had to deal with that. And then when they remade those games like 1.5, 2.5 remix for PS3 and PS4, they just grandfathered that in. But now the engine can handle as many AI partners as you need, so they just add them on.
Yeah, I always thought that was very interesting. Also, I noticed it when I was playing too. I first noticed it when I went to Toy Box, which is the Toy Story world, because Woody and Buzz just joined your party, and I assumed I would have to choose between them, and I didn't.
We did Tangled first, so we had Flynn and Rapunzel.
Right, and yeah, I think that's one of the exciting things about all of these remakes, as we've said in the past, is that the graphical upgrade really makes a difference. And I mean, you even see it in re-releases. Like I've mentioned several times now, I'm playing through Final Fantasy IX finally, and you can see more of that and follow on my social media. I'm posting about it. But like all they did was tighten up the backgrounds a bit and really tighten up the character models. So even at a distance, they don't seem blurry. Like if you're playing them on a large HD TV, they no longer look pixelated like they would if you tried to play a PS2 on your HD TV. Now, because they kind of messed with the graphics a little bit, but not really changing a lot, at least updated it so the game looks pretty in HD, which is a really huge difference from trying to play it on the PS1 or the PS2.
Yeah, you kind of get used to a certain quality of life. And if you are used to like, okay, I will dive into if I find an old game I've never played before for super cheap at like a con or something, yeah, I'll pick it up. And I've a I have to remind myself games didn't look as good then. And not just in a thing of like, oh, pixels. It's you forget how many quality of life upgrades happen from generation to generation.
Yeah.
And expecting people to go back to them can be a little much, and I get that.
Yeah, I found that my biggest difficulty is going pre-analog stick, being used to an analog stick. Like
Yes.
that's really interesting. Like I forget that Final Fantasy 9 and 10 it doesn't really matter because it's fixed camera views when you go from map part to map part, except when you're on the open world. And so, like, I forgot how much fixed camera there was in a lot of these games because we didn't have analog sticks. We couldn't really turn the camera efficiently. So instead, they took that out by making you not have to turn the camera at all, which just doesn't occur to you much, now because it's so ubiquitous.
Yeah, it's like, wait, my thumb's on the D-pad this entire time? What the hell?
Yeah, I don't understand.
I know, and I'm also thinking of to change it a little bit. I'm also thinking of times when there were remakes done where you don't necessarily you lose out on some stuff. Thinking of the Metal Gear Solid remake for the GameCube, the Twin Snakes, where they remade the first Metal Gear Solid using the Metal Gear Solid 2's engine, which I mean, the game looked better and it was very smooth. But you also were now able to aim in first-person mode, and you had access to a tranquilizer pistol, meaning you had a way to easily knock out guards, not kill them, and sneak past them. And those two elements alone completely broke the game. And areas and puzzles, practically, because it is kind of a puzzle game when you really get to its essence, of how do I get past these guys? How do I know what the radar is going to say until I get into this new area? Oh, let me just go into first-person view and snipe these guys with the tranquilizer pistol, and everything's fine. It's still a fun game, and I'm very happy to have it and play it. I love playing it, but you also have to understand that like if this is how you want people to, if they did this like 3 generations later, and like please experience this game, this revolutionary game, people would be like, this is easy and dumb. What the hell? So it's an example of it's not always an easy thing. Even if you keep all of the same elements, the same exact dialogue, the same actors, the same set pieces, doing a remake or a remaster, you may still lose kind of what is the essence of the game in the process.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's always bugged me about, like, we're talking about what games benefit from a remake the most, and I think it's the ones that jump multiple generations. I think the big thing about Twin Snakes kind of falling flat also is it was just from the PlayStation to the PlayStation 2 generation, except it was on the GameCube. But like it was
Right.
one generation further, and we got this remake. It's so close to the original now. I get it's also jumping consoles, and that was a big deal, and that's
Yeah.
really awesome. But I think as we get further from the original versions of these games, the more warranted those remakes are, especially if they're pinnacle series or games in a series. I mean, you look at the Crash Bandicoot and Spyro remakes that Toys for Bob has done, and Toys for Bob has pretty much made a name remaking games. They're currently working on remaking Crash Nitro Kart, which is going to be a lot of fun to play on a new generation console. These are all games that came out in PS1 or PS2 territory, which I feel like is far enough away that enough people now probably haven't even played those games. Like for me, I haven't bought it yet, but the reason I really want to play the Spyro collection is because I never played the original Spyro games, and they always looked like a lot of fun.
They are.
And, whereas with Crash Bandicoot, of course I played those, although I don't know that I had played 3 before I bought the Insane Trilogy. And it was really fun to revisit those games with tighter controls, and better graphics and better music and all of that. But those are games that, while they're remaking them, a lot of it is quality of life upgrades and not a lot of it is giant changes. Like they tightened the controls and improved the graphics and like made the controls consistent across all 3 games for Crash at least, which is really interesting choices. And the thing is also is they didn't just remake Crash 1.
No.
They remade the whole original trilogy. They haven't touched anything beyond that, and who knows if they will, because the later Crash games, I mean, while they could use a remake, some of them aren't even worth remaking.
They kind of lost their way there.
I think it's interesting when companies do that as well, because now they're not just focusing on a game that defines a time period, but a whole series. And you can't deny how impactful Crash Bandicoot and Spyro were both on early platforming games. I'm honestly surprised we haven't gotten another Mario 64 remake. We got one on the 3D, on the regular DS rather, ages ago. But I'm kind of surprised they haven't remade it again because, that was one of the most defining platformers ever created.
Well, Mario as a series is definitely... It doesn't do a lot of remakes.
That's true.
I mean, not since Mario All-Stars.
Yeah.
And, also the Mario Advance series.
That's true. Well, and I guess with Luigi's Mansion coming out on the 3DS, because the sequel to Luigi's Mansion was 3DS only, makes sense. And that was essentially a remake. Like, I'm sure they improved the graphics and controls and stuff.
Yeah, they bring it to handhelds. They make it a new experience like that. But I remember playing through Super Mario Odyssey, that this is the culmination of what Mario 64 started.
That's true. And I guess because the games don't deviate that much, like adding Cappy did change some of the dynamics, but not all of it, that effectively Odyssey is a remake of 64 because the core mechanics are very much the same.
Complete with visiting the Mushroom Kingdom and collecting some stars.
Yes, exactly. And they do even have a hat and costume of the N64 version of Mario, which was kind of a nice homage. I guess I wonder if we'll ever stop remaking games. I guess just the same way now at this point that we often remake movies and re-release movies, I guess we'll never really get away from remakes. But, I worry that sometimes it's a cash grab. Like, there are rumors floating around that we're going to get a Castlevania collection because there was a trademark published in, I think, Australia recently.
Australia, yes, it was.
And so everyone's flipping out that we're going to get, like, an original run of Castlevania games re-released or, like, a Castlevania trilogy or something. And that sounds great. And, like, they just re-released Symphony of the Night, but only on PlayStation. And, like, I would love to get these games on the Switch and be able to play a collection of them. And, like, I'm not against that. But I just wonder, like, especially for Konami, like, Konami has notably had some difficulties recently with letting go Kojima. And, like, a lot of them, the games kind of falling to the wayside and them halting development on stuff. I wonder if this is like, hey, we need money. Let's throw out these old games that people love and just get a quick cash grab. And when that's the mentality driving something, that quality is going to suffer because they're not going to be as fine-tuned on the details if they just want to bring in some cash.
No, this is true. And Castlevania is an interesting one in thinking about what makes it a Castlevania game. Because there's a couple of points in unpacking that, I think. One is the fact that a series can continue in a spiritual sense while not sharing the name or even being made by the same company.
Right.
We've spoken at length over several episodes about Bloodstained, about Mighty Number 9, about Shovel Knight, about games that are made by new companies that either successfully or unsuccessfully, carry on a legacy of a previous franchise. And Castlevania is one that has two main ideas. There are classic Castlevanias and there are Metroidvanias. You have and the Castlevania Requiem, Dracula X is sort of a very defining classic Castlevania, where Symphony of the Night started the Metroidvania idea. It's a series that's run for long enough that you can make a game that is still a Castlevania game, but lacks a lot of elements, but has many others. I just recently, finally, acquired a copy of Castlevania Order of Ecclesia, which is the last of 3 Nintendo DS titles they released.
Mm-hmm.
For the Game Boy Advance and for the Nintendo DS, they released Metroidvania-style games, and very good ones, I might add.
Yes.
Now, Order of Ecclesia is wildly different for a couple of reasons. One, it's not all one big castle. It's a lot of separate areas that you actually go to an overworld map and select where you're going next. So you kind of come at it as though they are each separate levels where you have a level select. You get through one area to unlock the next one. You find a map here that lets you know where that is. But then if you want to go from town all the way over there, you don't have to slog through it again. You can just select, all right, I'm going to this forest now. Also the fact that it is tough. I have died so many times playing this game. I have suffered many deaths, and that is frustrating, but it also feels very classic. And so they've kind of taken a bit of Castlevania 2 and a bit of classic Castlevania, the original, and wrapped it up in a Nintendo DS Metroidvania style presentation. And I remember reviews about this game being a little lukewarm, and I see why now. I'm loving this game and I'm having a lot of fun with it. But they went almost too far back for the people who like that kind of a game. And it's interesting to see which of these elements go, well, this isn't a Castlevania game, oh, but this is.
Well, right, because Castlevania is one of those game series that have had a lot of changes. I mean, if you think about it, that's kind of going back to Resident Evil, where it faltered for the same thing. Like early Resident Evil and then mid-life cycle Resident Evils had very different gameplay styles.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that Resident Evil 2, the remake, has seemed to have molded those two styles together much better than a lot of other game series.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes time for that to happen, and it's interesting to see what goes on. I also think of the Legend of Zelda series in that regard.
Right, and that what defines a Legend of Zelda game. Well, and actually, it's funny you bring up Legend of Zelda because we are getting the first remake in that series for a long time. If you don't if you don't count the 3DS ports, because the 3DS ports of the N64 games are essentially sort of remakes. They're kind of, remasters.
They are ports.
Yeah, they're mostly ports, but they are actually remaking for the Nintendo Switch Link's Awakening. Which
is one of my favorite Legend of Zelda games.
And it's a Zelda game I've not really played, and so I'm really excited about it. But this is a remake in its truest sense, because while the gameplay style is already very similar to the Super Nintendo Zeldas, the top-down, this was, the first handheld game to have that, and it's been pretty ubiquitous for like Link Between Worlds and a bunch of other games, Minish Cap, a ton of the games that have come out. They're doing a graphics overhaul, though, completely as well, and a sound overhaul. Like, it is a true remake, and we haven't really seen this in the Zelda franchise before.
No, we haven't. And whereas we got something like Breath of the Wild, which was a huge change from what the last few iterations of the Legend of Zelda formula was giving us, Link's Awakening was a deviation all the way back then.
Yeah.
And it actually introduced a few new items. It was a very different kind of quest. There was no Ganon. It was a very different story. It was all kinds of stuff that, even at the fourth game, people were like, but that's not what Zelda does. Mega Man always fights Dr. Wily. Belmont's always killed Dracula. Link always saves Zelda and fights Ganon. Not in this game.
Well, yeah, and what's really interesting about that, too, is that since then, that's become not always the case as well. And we haven't really had a consistent Zelda gameplay style over multiple generations for a while. I mean, I guess you could say that, Twilight Princess did build on Ocarina of Time, and Skyward Sword did build on Twilight Princess, but Wind Waker was very unique, and so is now Breath of the Wild. And so to go back now to the top-down Zelda games of the past with a remake of one of the most well-known ones is really interesting, especially considering, like you said, it, at the time, wasn't a core Zelda game. It wasn't like the previous iterations.
Right, and it was considered Legend of Zelda 4, and it was considered a sequel to Link to the Past.
Yep.
Like, it is that Link. That is it's that character.
Yep. And so this will be a remake, and there are 3 games in that series now, because Link Between Worlds is also that Link, or in that world, that version of Hyrule.
Yes, it is.
And so what's really fascinating about this remake above a lot of others is this is also a game that was originally a handheld game that's being ported to a console. But that said, this main console is also a handheld.
Right. It's really showing how the lines are blurring.
Right. And you have to assume, though, the Game Boy game wasn't that long. So they must be adding something to this version, new dungeons or new bosses or whatever, because, a lot of Game Boy games were on the shorter side because that was the point. You were be able to pick up and play. And so I'm curious about what they're actually adding to the game, because they didn't really go into that in the trailer. It was mostly, hey, look how pretty the new version of this game looks. Here's a game that you've wanted us to remake for ages. We're finally doing it. Shut up, take a look.
Yeah, but I mean, also Link's Awakening was on the longer side as far as a Game Boy game goes. I would say it was a 5-hour adventure.
Okay.
Which, I mean, probably more than that. I'm referencing howlongtobeat.com, a wonderful site that gives you a nice average of how long it should take you to complete the main story of a game, main story plus some extras, or doing a completionist run where you get everything. The Link's Awakening DX, the deluxe version released for the Game Boy Color, lists the main story as taking 14 and a half hours.
Wow, I'm surprised. All right.
It is actually it's a hell of an adventure. You still got 8 dungeons. They've got lots and lots of puzzles.
Yeah, that's true. Nintendo was never really afraid of having long games if that's what they wanted to do.
And if the saving was easy, you were still able to play in bite-sized chunks.
Right.
Which is what the handheld experience was. But no, it was still a long game. It was still one you could take on a plane ride, and you may not beat it all at one. I mean, speedruns can now get it down to an hour and a half, but it did take you a little while to get through it. So, all they got to do is add a couple of cinematic whooshy whooshes on it, and it'll be a 20-hour game.
I mean, what's interesting to me is we're talking about in this episode what define games that defined a series that were worth remaking. And for the Zelda series, Link's Awakening is not the first game I would think of. It's not a bad game. I've heard it's very good. I, again, haven't really played it. But it wouldn't be the first thing I'd think to remake, especially in this current generation. We're far enough from the N64 and the Super Nintendo that I thought that those for sure would be games that they would remake. And so it's interesting that this is the game they chose.
Well, I would have to say that a lot of the 3D formula felt, for lack of a better term, stale.
Right.
Before Breath of the Wild happened. Now, granted, I have played most of the 3D games. I haven't beaten most of the 3D games. And I do have a little bit of bias. There is a fantastic half-hour-long video about the nature of Zelda sequels done by Aaron Hansen, Egoraptor, Sequelitis,
yes.
Legend of Zelda. It is very worth watching.
I agree.
And it's a great one if you just want to build up your critical eye about sacred cows in your gaming history.
Right.
And the fact that, there's a definite formula. And it's one of the videos that made me think of this subject for this episode. The idea of, okay, we're remaking a game. What needs to be kept? What needs to be changed? What needs to be thrown out? And sometimes in trying to keep the trappings, or if they ever do a full-on crazy cool remake of Symphony of the Night and they change up the dialogue people are going to be so mad.
Right, because that's
But
almost as iconic as the gameplay.
right, but that's not what makes that game.
Right.
But it is, but it isn't. And you can get very caught up on the window dressing, and you can get caught up on these little details that maybe you change how that detail comes out. Maybe you know, if you've got like tapestries and tomes that you read in a big remake of Symphony of the Night, and that's something scrawled out, then cool, you've referenced it. And you don't have to make it like something that takes you out of this big cinematic experience. And these are the weird things that have to get navigated when you, and not even when you remake a series or when you remake a game, but when you make new ones. What is it that brings people in? What can we do with our technology now? What can our engines be? And how will we create a similar experience that evolves?
Well, yeah, that's actually a really good point, because a game that we've both been playing, which is the Let's Go, Pikachu, and Eevee games, those are remakes of the original red, blue, and green Pokemon games.
Yes.
And, there are a lot of quality of life changes that people bitched about that are actually really good, like being able to see Pokemon in the wild, being able to avoid battles and not having to actually fight every Pokemon, just capturing them a la Pokemon Go, but then still fighting trainers, which I thought was a really great improvement. But now we have a trailer released very recently for Sword and Shield, the two new next-gen Pokemon games with new starters, a new world, and it looks like random battles are back. And there's a bit of kerfuffle in the Pokemon community because while diehard Pokemon gamers are like, oh, that's how it should be, that's how it should have always been, and I'm glad it's back, a lot of people who came into the series with Let's Go are like, but why? This is a really great mechanic, and it's a great way to play the game. Why would you take that out?
Yeah. And Pokemon is definitely a game of, I feel like it is the height of terrible puns to talk about evolving gameplay with Pokemon.
Yeah.
But it's one that has had to, no, it's had to add some variations. It's had to change and move while still having these strange roots that but I guess we can't move these, but we can, but we did, but we didn't. Red, blue, green, and yellow, that whole generation got remade in Gen 3 for the Game Boy Advance with Fire Red and Leaf Green.
Right.
And that already showed how much the series had changed since its original release back on the original Game Boy. But it also showed, there's always that complaint of oh, they didn't change enough. Oh, they've changed too much. I feel like Pokemon should be the subject of its own episode.
That's probably very true. It's because it's also a fan base that comes from a lot of different places. Unlike other Nintendo properties, there's an anime, there's a manga, there's a card game. There's so many different entry points to the series. And for me, I've played almost every generation of Pokemon. I think I've missed one or two in the middle.
Same.
But that said, while I was a little hesitant about Let's Go, once I played it, I was like, oh, these changes make sense. And there's still Pokemon battles. There's still Pokemon evolution. It's not just a stupid story version of Go, which I only say stupid to mock the people who are making those arguments. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But
you're almost quoting here.
Right. But I had a friend who refused to buy this game because he's like, I don't want to play Pokemon Go with a story. I was like, but it's not that. If you look deeper, you can tell it's not. And I'm happy to report, though I still haven't finished it yet, I really like Let's Go Pikachu.
Same.
I think it's a fun version of it. I think my problem is that it's still too close to the original. The story, if you come back to it after not playing for months, you have no idea where to go. You have no idea what the next city to move on to is.
Right.
There's not really any fast travel. All these things that probably would have benefited this game, they didn't really put in it, which is fine. But I think that the Pokemon community just gets so wrapped up in the minute details that when the generation of games make strides, it still holds itself back. I think one of the reasons I loved X and Y so much and didn't really like Sun and Moon is I felt like Sun and Moon was a step back to older generations. A lot of the cool story-driven stuff that they added in X and Y, and the way they really focused on the narrative, I felt like didn't really exist in Sun and Moon. Sun and Moon was back to being, oh, you're just a guy doing a thing, getting Pokemon. Like, it didn't seem as big as the previous stories for Black and White or X and Y had.
And yet there were still some longer story sequences in Sun and Moon than there were in X and Y.
Right. And I think a lot of the Pokemon games, because the stories are, made to be so personal, you're playing as this kid, this avatar of yourself that's going on a grand adventure, that people take to those stories away more personally. And when minor changes come, people lose their minds.
Well, and also Pokemon is more than just a series. It's practically its own industry.
That's true, too.
Because of the anime, because of the stuffed animals, the card games, the everything else. And if you just look at the video games alone, there are so many video game releases. There are the 7, soon to be 8 generations of mainline Pokemon games. And then there are so many other games that they've just either haphazardly or very delicately slapped Pokemon on it.
That's
true.
true.
There are several kinds of puzzle games you can play that have varying levels of Pokemon style involvement. There have been several Pokemon pinball games for handhelds. There has been a Pokemon racing game. There have been console RPGs of Pokemon that still aren't considered main Pokemon games, which is really interesting when you want to unpack that one. And there have been so many variant releases of Pokemon branded things that we almost allow but don't allow a lot of changes. It's like, okay, if it's an outside of the mainline game, do whatever you want. Oh, Pokemon Ranger, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. Yeah, shake up the Mystery Dungeon formula, whatever, throw some Pokemon in there. But if it is a main Pokemon release, there's all kinds of expectations, and everybody has their own ideas of what defines a Pokemon experience. And so it's interesting to see how hard people hold that line, but also how wide the margin is before hitting it.
Well, yeah. And I think also for Pokemon, the series, it's one of the few game series that I continue to play, though I rarely beat the games. I think besides Gen 1 and then X and Y and Black and White, I've never really beaten the other games. And it's not because they're not good. It's just I don't see them through to the end. I like playing the game, but eventually something else comes along that steals my attention, or I just get bored of capturing and training Pokemon.
Yeah. Part of me, like the very likes things to be in their way part of my brain, the very order things out, really wants to complete some Pokedexes.
Yeah.
And that has gotten harder and harder.
What?
And I still want to.
I mean, considering how large those Pokedexes are now and the fact that there are just so many Pokemon. Like, I remember when there were 101 Pokemon.
151.
151, that's right. See, shows how much I remember.
But it's kind of easy to forget the details when it keeps coming at you, and you go like, all right, which games do I complete the Pokedex for?
Yeah, it's clear that we need to do a whole separate episode just about Pokemon. But going back to remakes, I think Pokemon, like Zelda and like certain other game series in the Nintendo pantheon, it's just rare that we get remakes. Outside of those, like you said, we don't really get a lot of Mario remakes, but we have gotten quite a few Zelda ports and remakes, and we've gotten a ton of Pokemon remakes, which I had forgotten about, honestly, until you reminded me. And so it's just interesting because I think it's not only games that define a game series, but sometimes it's games that define a genre or even a studio or company as well. Like, I think
Yes.
The reason Mario Maker exists at all is because of the impact Super Mario has had over the years. And instead of remaking those older games, except like the Advanced Series and All-Stars, they said, how about you remake them? How about, here's all the tools, you could just recreate these stages beat for beat, or you can make your own, which I think is a fascinating way of deviating from just remaking those games.
It was also a sequel to Mario Paint.
Right, essentially. Yeah, that's true. And the fact that we are getting a sequel to Mario Maker for the Switch, which I'm surprised. I thought we were just going to get a port, which, I mean, I guess apples to oranges, because when it's a game that's not really a game, it's a maker. Adding features could be considered a port, but I don't want to get into that. But
I don't know. They're adding a lot.
they are adding a lot. Like slopes. Apparently people are excited for slopes.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting to kind of take that dynamic, and I'm surprised a lot of other companies haven't done that. Like, instead of making remakes, saying, how about you remake something? Here's the tools to do it. That's one of the biggest things about a lot of the Elder Scrolls and Fallout is that the PC versions have mod support, and like people recreate their own stories in those games just using the tools that the developers use to build those games.
Mm-hmm. And that idea of like, well, if we can't please everybody, here's ways for everyone to please themselves.
Right, exactly.
And those create defining experiences as well, even if they're not necessarily universal. But some people, when they think of Skyrim, they think of the mods they play on it. I've barely ever played that mod, but when I think of Skyrim, I think of the mod that replaces dragons with Thomas the Tank Engine.
Oh, that's a good one. See, I think of the one that replaces them with Macho Man Randy Savage.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good. The dragon shouts are way more entertaining.
Oh, I can imagine.
But yeah, I think for me, I think what's really fascinating about remake culture now versus even, a little under a year ago when we talked about it last is that a lot more remakes now seem to be pushing the boundary of the word remake because they're almost brand new games. Like, if you'd never played Resident Evil 2 before and you played the new one, I think you'd get probably the same experience that you did even if you had the nostalgia, because it's just such a well-made game and it's so different yet the same that I don't know that you need the history of Resident Evil as a player to enjoy that game.
Yeah. And this allows people of all ages, all stripes, all experience levels to bring their knowledge to the game, have it challenged, and have a challenging, fun experience, which at the end of the day is what, that I feel like that's what defines games in general, or it should.
For sure. And I'm sure there are remakes we haven't talked about. This is our second time diving into this topic, and I'm sure we'll revisit it again, as I don't see remakes slowing down anytime soon. But I'm curious what games, listener, that you feel like haven't been remade that is like so obvious that they should have been, or remakes that you really love that have come out. Either or. We're always looking to grow this conversation, but I'm curious what people consider a good remake or what should be remade that hasn't.
Yeah, and maybe, in 5 years, we'll actually be talking about the Final Fantasy VII remake.
Yeah, that one, now they've said it's going to be episodic, and it's like, really, guys, can we not do that?
We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. We don't control it.
I mean, I've been a big advocate of I want that game to be different. I want the story to be the same, but I want the game to be different. Because if I want to play the same game, I'll play the game that exists. Like, do something interesting with it. But not a lot of people agree with that. A lot of people are like, oh, remakes, like they should follow the same structure, but just look prettier. And I'm like, then why?
But again, if the game hasn't been re-released on new consoles already, then maybe you'd have an argument there. But you could play Final Fantasy VII easily on the PS4, on the Switch, I think on the Xbox One now. And you could certainly play it on Steam. So if you're making a new experience, make a new experience.
Right.
So we would like to hear from all of you, your thoughts on that sort of remake and all the others. What has been your favorite remake, your favorite remaster, your least favorite? What is your favorite series, and what makes it that way for you? What is part of the experience that should never be lost? We want to know all of these things. So this is a conversation. Thank you for keeping it going. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.